Your Honor, my daughter is unstable. She's a danger to herself. My father said it like he was ordering coffee, calm, polished, practiced. The courtroom was packed with family, all waiting for me to break. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stared at the clock, because in 4 minutes, his lie would become evidence. Once the evidence spoke, he wouldn't be my father anymore. He'd be my defendant. And that's exactly what I'd been waiting for. Because Richard Brennan had spent 20 years calling me crazy. 20 years convincing everyone I knew that I was fragile, unstable, incapable of handling my own life. 20 years of gaslighting so thorough that even I sometimes wondered if he was right. But you can't gaslight a bank statement. And after 3 years of planning, I was about to prove it. My name is Sarah Brennan, and as I sat in the hard wooden chair of the Kingswell County Probate Court, I watched my father assassinate my character with the precision of a surgeon. The air in the courtroom was stale, smelling faintly of lemon floor wax and old paper. It was a suffocating, heavy atmosphere that usually made people sweat. But I felt cold. Freezing, actually. It was the kind of cold that starts in the marrow of your bones and works its way out. My hands were folded in my lap, resting on the dark fabric of my trousers. I kept my thumbs still. I knew that if I twiddled them even once, Richard would point it out. He'd say it was a sign of my nervousness, a sign of my erratic energy, a sign that I was exactly what he was telling Judge Catherine Hayes I was, mentally unstable. Richard stood at the podium, his posture a carefully curated mix of strength and heartbreak. He wore his navy blue suit, the one he saved for church and board meetings, the one that made him look like a pillar of the community. He held a white handkerchief in his left hand, dabbing at eyes that were suspiciously dry but squinted in a way that suggested held-back tears. "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice cracking perfectly on the word honor. It was a performance worthy of Broadway. It breaks a father's heart to say these things. I counted the tiles on the ceiling, 32 visible from my seat. Focus on the tiles, not on the lies. "I have tried everything," he continued. "We've tried to help Sarah privately. We wanted to keep this within the family, but her behavior has become erratic. She's a danger to her own financial future, and frankly, I fear for her safety." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a death sentence. "She cannot manage the estate my late mother left her. She simply lacks the cognitive tether to reality required for such responsibility." I felt the eyes of the entire room boring into the back of my neck. The courtroom was packed. It wasn't just strangers or board clerks. Richard had ensured an audience. My Aunt Patricia Walsh was there, clutching her purse like a shield. My cousins, Emily and Tyler, were sitting in the second row, looking down at their shoes. They were the chorus in Richard's tragedy. Silent witnesses brought here to validate his grief. They were waiting for the scene they'd been promised. They were waiting for crazy Sarah to make an appearance. They expected me to jump up. They expected me to scream that he was a liar. They expected me to throw a water pitcher or burst into hysterical tears. That was the narrative Richard had fed them for years. Sarah is sensitive. Sarah is manic. Sarah imagines things. If I reacted now, if I showed even a single ounce of anger, I would be signing my own conservatorship papers. So I became a gray rock. I stared at the wood grain on the table in front of me. I slowed my breathing. In for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. The technique my therapist taught me, the one Richard didn't know I saw, at a practice 40 miles from home, paid for in cash. I didn't look at Richard. I didn't look at Aunt Patricia. I let his words wash over me like dirty water, refusing to let them soak in. I was not a daughter today. I was a vault. Richard continued, his confidence growing as I remained silent. He took my silence for defeat. He thought he had already won. He turned slightly, angling his body so the gallery could see his pained profile. "She has isolated herself, Your Honor," Richard said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "She refuses to drive. She lives in a tiny apartment in a questionable part of town, despite having the means to live safely. She hoards her income. She refuses to engage with the family." He paused for effect. "These are not the actions of a well-adjusted 35-year-old woman." These are the actions of someone who has lost touch with the world. William Cross, my father's attorney, stepped up next. Cross was a man who smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. He was a shark in a tailored suit, hired because he had a reputation for getting results, not for his ethics. He paced in front of the judge's bench, holding a file folder as if it contained nuclear codes. "Your Honor, if I may," Cross said, his voice smooth and oily. "We have statements here regarding Ms. Brennan's living conditions. No vehicle, no television, minimal furniture. She works a low-level clerical job despite her degree. She has cut off all social ties." He turned to face Judge Hayes directly. "We're looking at a pattern of severe self-neglect. Mr. Brennan is simply asking for the legal authority to step in and provide the care his daughter obviously cannot provide for herself. He seeks guardianship of the person and conservatorship of the estate to prevent her from squandering the assets through negligence or falling victim to fraud due to her diminished capacity." Diminished capacity. The words hung in the air. I looked at the clock on the wall above the judge's head. The second hand ticked rhythmically. Tick, tick, tick. It was 2:03 in the afternoon. I calculated the time. I needed him to say it all. I needed every lie on the record. The court reporter's fingers were flying across her stenotype machine, capturing every syllable. That was good. That was exactly what I wanted. Richard was digging a hole, and he was so busy admiring the shovel that he didn't notice the dirt was piling up on top of him. Judge Hayes adjusted her glasses and looked down at me. She was a stern woman with sharp eyes that had seen every version of family dysfunction imaginable. She didn't look impressed by Richard's theatrics, but she didn't look convinced of my sanity either. Silence can be interpreted in two ways: dignity or catatonia. I needed to make sure she understood which one it was. "Ms. Brennan," Judge Hayes said. Her voice cut through the murmurs in the gallery. I slowly lifted my head. I met her gaze. I didn't blink. "Ms. Brennan," the judge continued, "your father and his counsel have made some very serious allegations regarding your mental health and your ability to manage your finances. They claim you're unstable. They claim you're a risk to yourself. You've sat there silently for 20 minutes. Do you have nothing to say?" The room went deadly quiet. Even the ventilation system seemed to pause, suspending the dust motes in the stagnant air. I could hear Richard inhale sharply, preparing his sympathetic face for whatever outburst he thought was coming. Aunt Patricia leaned forward in her seat. William Cross smirked, just a fraction of an inch. This was the trap. If I spoke with emotion, I was unstable. If I stayed silent, I was incompetent. I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed myself up. I moved slowly, deliberately. I didn't rush. I smoothed the front of my blazer. I turned my body so I was facing the judge squarely, but I kept my peripheral vision locked on my father. I wanted to see the moment the doubt started to creep in. I cleared my throat. My voice was not loud, but it was steady. It was the voice I used in my real line of work, not the clerical cover job my father mocked, but my actual career as a forensic fraud investigator. It was a voice stripped of all unnecessary noise. "Your Honor," I said, "I apologize for my silence. I was not being disrespectful." Richard shifted on his feet. He didn't like this tone. It was too rational. "Then what were you doing?" Judge Hayes asked, raising an eyebrow. I turned my head slowly and looked at Richard for the first time since the hearing began. I made eye contact. I let him see the cold, hard reality in my eyes. I let him see that the daughter he thought he could bully was gone. In her place was something much more dangerous. "I was waiting for my father to finish his performance," I said. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. It was a collective intake of breath from the family members who had been sold the story of the fragile, weeping Sarah. They were seeing someone else. They were seeing a woman who stood tall, whose hands didn't shake, whose voice didn't waver. Richard's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He stepped forward, forgetting his role for a split second. "See?" Richard sputtered, pointing a finger at me. "See the disrespect? This is the paranoia I told you about, Your Honor. She thinks everything is a plot against her. She thinks her own father's concern is a performance." William Cross reached out and touched Richard's arm, trying to silence him, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped. Just for a second, the grieving father was replaced by the controlling tyrant. Judge Hayes saw it. Her eyes narrowed. "Mr. Brennan, sit down," the judge ordered. Her voice was like a whip crack. Richard froze. He realized his mistake. He sat down heavily, smoothing his tie, trying to regain his composure. But the energy in the room had shifted. The air was no longer heavy with pity. It was electric with tension. I remained standing. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just looked at the judge. "Your Honor, the allegations regarding my mental instability are entirely based on anecdotes provided by my father," I said. "He claims I cannot manage money. He claims I live in poverty because I'm incapable of understanding wealth. He claims I'm a danger to the estate my grandmother left me." I paused. I reached into my bag, which was sitting on the floor by my feet. Every eye followed my hand. Richard stretched his neck to see what I was doing. Cross looked nervous. I pulled out a single thick manila envelope. It was sealed with red tape. It looked official. It looked dangerous. I placed the envelope gently on the table in front of my lawyer, Jessica Price. Jessica had been silent until now, following my instructions to the letter. She looked at the envelope, then up at me. She knew what was inside, but she hadn't seen the physical evidence until this moment. "My father has spent the last 40 minutes telling you what he thinks is true," I said to the judge, my voice dropping an octave, making everyone lean in to hear. "He has told you a story, a very compelling story, but courts don't rule on stories, Your Honor. They rule on evidence." I looked at the clock again. It was now 2:15 in the afternoon. The bank transfers would be fully traced by now. The digital footprints were locked. The trap was sprung. "I am not asking you to believe me," I continued. "I am asking you to look at the facts. My father says I'm unstable because I don't spend my money. I submit to the court that I don't spend my money because I've been too busy tracking where he's been spending it." Richard's face went white. All the color drained out of him in a single terrifying second. It was as if someone had pulled a plug. "Objection!" William Cross shouted, jumping to his feet. "This is irrelevant! This is hearsay!" "It's not hearsay if it's on a bank ledger," I said calmly. Judge Hayes held up a hand to silence the lawyer. She looked at the envelope on the desk, then she looked at me. There was a glimmer of something new in her eyes. It wasn't pity anymore. It was curiosity, and perhaps a little bit of respect. "Ms. Price," the judge said to my lawyer, "what is in that envelope?" I sat down slowly, resuming my position of absolute stillness. I crossed my hands in my lap. I looked at my father one last time. He looked like a man who had just heard the click of a landmine under his foot. But to understand why Richard thought he could stand in a court of law and erase my existence with a few well-rehearsed lies, you have to understand the architecture of his manipulation. It didn't start in that courtroom. It didn't start when he filed the emergency petition. It started 20 years ago at the dinner table, in the back seat of his car, in the quiet hallways of our family home. Richard Brennan was not just a liar. He was a weaver. He took the threads of reality and respun them until the fabric looked exactly the way he wanted it to. The day we buried my grandmother Eleanor, the funeral home smelled of lilies and floor polish. The scent was so strong it made my stomach turn. Or maybe that was the grief. I was sitting in the front row, staring at the closed casket, trying to breathe through the weight on my chest. I wasn't crying. I was in shock. The kind of shock that makes the world feel like it's wrapped in cotton wool. Sounds muffled, colors muted. Eleanor had been the only one who saw me clearly, the only one who ever told Richard to shut up when he started diagnosing me in public. "Sarah's not fragile, Richard, you're just heavy-handed." When she died, I lost my anchor. Richard sat next to me. He leaned over to Aunt Patricia, who was on his other side. His voice was low, but loud enough for me to hear, and I knew that was intentional. "Look at her," he said, his voice soaked with concern. "She's dissociating. She can't handle the reality of death. I'm worried she's going to snap." He was rewriting my grief in real time. An hour later, we were in the small reception room at the funeral home. I was holding a cup of lukewarm coffee, trying to find a quiet corner where I could just exist, process, breathe. Richard cornered me. He didn't come with a hug. He came with a stack of documents. "Sarah, sweetheart," he said, putting a heavy hand on my shoulder. It felt less like comfort and more like a restraint. "We need to handle some logistics. Grandma left a complicated estate. There are tax implications, filings, things that require immediate attention." I looked at the papers. The text was dense, the font small. My eyes couldn't focus. "What is this?" I asked. "Just formalities," he said, clicking a pen and pressing it into my hand. "It's a temporary authorization. It allows me to talk to her lawyers and accountants so you don't have to. You don't need that stress, Sarah. You're already so fragile. Let me carry this burden for you." I looked around the room. Aunt Patricia was watching us, nodding encouragingly. My cousins were eating sandwiches, oblivious. I felt small. I felt tired. And more than anything, I felt the crushing weight of the identity he had forced on me. If I refused, I was being difficult. If I argued, I was being paranoid. If I read the papers, all 20 pages, I was being distrustful of my own father at my grandmother's funeral. So I signed. I signed my name on the dotted line. And with that ink, I gave him the keys to the kingdom. I thought I was signing a permission slip for him to pay the funeral bills. In reality, I was signing the first brick in the wall he was building around me. That signature would haunt me for 3 years. Growing up, I was never just Sarah. I was Sarah the sensitive one, Sarah the fragile. When I was 10 years old, I got lost in the grocery store. My father had left me in the cereal aisle to take a phone call and forgot about me for 45 minutes. When he finally found me, sitting calmly by the customer service desk reading a magazine, he didn't apologize. He told the manager loud enough for everyone to hear. "She wanders off in these fugue states. I can't take my eyes off her for a second." When I was 15, I got an A+ on a difficult calculus exam. I was proud. I'd studied for weeks. When I showed Richard, he didn't congratulate me on my intelligence. He frowned, felt my forehead, and told our neighbor that I'd been studying with a manic intensity that worried him. He framed my focus as obsession. He framed my passion as hysteria. When I was 20 and lost my car keys, which every human being does at some point, it wasn't carelessness in Richard's narrative. It was a symptom of early onset cognitive decline, or a lack of connection to the physical world. He planted these seeds in the minds of everyone we knew, my cousins, my aunts, even my teachers, and he watered them with his concern. Poor Sarah. She tries so hard, but she's just not built for the pressure of the real world. He said it with such love, such convincing paternal worry, that no one ever thought to question why the girl they saw didn't match the girl he described. By the time I was 25, the family didn't see me anymore. They saw the broken caricature Richard had drawn for them, and I started to see it too. But 3 years ago, standing in that funeral home with ink still wet on papers I hadn't read, something clicked. I made a choice. It was a survival instinct I'd picked up from watching nature documentaries. When an animal is hunted, it has 2 options: fight and die or play dead. I chose to play dead. I retreated. I moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that made Richard turn up his nose. I sold my car and started taking the bus. I stopped buying new clothes. I stopped talking about my ambitions. I became exactly what Richard said I was, a recluse, a woman who could barely function, someone who lived a small, gray life. To Richard, this was victory. He looked at my cheap shoes and my empty living room, and he saw a conquered city. He saw a daughter who had finally accepted her incompetence. He stopped watching me closely because he thought there was nothing left to see. But he was wrong. He thought I was working as a low-level clerk at a company called Sterling Records Management. In his mind, I was filing papers and fetching coffee, earning barely enough to pay my rent. He loved that image. It made him feel powerful. What my father didn't know, what he never bothered to check because his arrogance was a blinder, was what Sterling Records Management actually did. Sterling was a cover name, a boring shell company used by a private contracting firm that specialized in high-level forensic accounting and fraud investigation for major financial institutions. I was not a clerk. I was a senior risk analyst. My job was to hunt people like my father. My days were spent swimming in oceans of data. I tracked embezzlers who siphoned millions through shell companies in the Caymans. I built profiles on corporate executives who used company funds to buy yachts and silence mistresses. I could look at a spreadsheet with 10,000 rows of data and spot the single entry that didn't belong. I knew how to follow digital footprints that people thought they'd washed away. I knew that money always leaves a trail, no matter how clever the thief thinks they are. And while I hunted strangers by day, by night, I hunted my father. I treated my life with Richard as an active investigation. The gray rock personality was my undercover persona. Every time he called me to lecture me about my lifestyle, I wasn't just listening, I was transcribing. I had a server, encrypted and hidden off-site, where I stored everything. Every voicemail he left me where his tone shifted from sweet to threatening. Every email where he gaslit me about family events. I scanned every birthday card, every note, every scrap of paper he ever handed me. I knew that men like Richard rely on memory. They rely on the fact that human memory is faulty, that emotion blurs the edges of what was said. I never said that, Sarah. You're imagining things. But digital files don't imagine things. Audio recordings don't have bad days. Metadata doesn't forget. There was one moment about 6 months ago that almost broke my resolve. I was at a family barbecue sitting on the edge of the patio, watching Richard hold court by the grill. He was laughing, telling a story about how I'd gotten lost in the grocery store when I was 10. He was making it sound like a tragedy, like I'd wandered off in a fugue state. The reality was that he'd abandoned me in the cereal aisle to take a phone call. Aunt Patricia sat down next to me. She handed me a plate of potato salad. "He loves you, you know," she said, watching him. I looked at her. Patricia wasn't a bad woman, but she was a weak one. She valued peace over truth. "He lies about me, Aunt Patricia," I said quietly. "He tells people I'm sick. I'm not sick." Patricia sighed, the sound of a woman who had spent 50 years sweeping dirt under rugs. "Oh, Sarah," she said. "Does it matter? He just worries. He wants to be the protector. Just let him be the dad. It's easier that way. Just give in to him a little, and the house stays quiet. Why fight it? Just give in. Give." That sentence hit me harder than any insult Richard had ever thrown. It was the philosophy of the enabler. It was the permission slip for abuse. Keep the peace at the cost of your soul. I looked at Patricia, and I realized that she would never help me. None of them would. They were all hostages to his narrative. If I wanted to be free, I couldn't just leave. I had to burn the narrative to the ground. I had to show them the monster, not just tell them about it. That night, I went home to my small apartment, locked the deadbolt, and turned on my 3 monitors. The blue light washed over my face, the only makeup I wore these days. I logged into the trust fund portal. Eleanor had left me a significant amount of money. But because of the papers I'd signed at the funeral, Richard had oversight. He couldn't withdraw funds directly without a second signature, mine, but he had view access and administrative rights to manage the investment portfolio. Or so the structure was supposed to be. I had never touched the money. I let it sit there, knowing that to Richard, an untouched pot of gold is an irresistible temptation. He couldn't stand the idea of resources sitting idle. He needed to control it. For 3 years, the account had been clean. He was careful. He knew that if he stole a large amount, alarms would go off. He was waiting for me to be declared incompetent so he could take it all legally. But that night, I saw it. It wasn't a withdrawal. It was a fee, $25.50. To the average person, it looked like a bank service charge. It was labeled admin maintenance fee. It was small enough to be invisible, the kind of number your eyes glide over when you're looking at a statement with 6 zeros. But I knew this bank. I knew their fee structures because I had audited them 2 years ago for a client. This bank did not charge maintenance fees on trust accounts with a balance over $100,000. I clicked on the transaction ID. I traced the routing number. It didn't go to the bank. It went to a shell corporation registered in Delaware called Apex Consulting Group. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't the $25. It was the test. Richard was pinging the fence. He was sending a tiny, insignificant amount through a side door to see if anyone was watching. He was testing the alarm system. I sat back in my chair and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since the funeral. He thought the house was empty. He thought the security cameras were off. He thought Sarah, the unstable daughter, was too busy crying into her pillow to notice a $25 fee. I didn't block the transaction. I didn't call the bank. I didn't call Aunt Patricia. I opened a new spreadsheet. I typed the date, the time, the amount, and the destination. I labeled the file, the _ROPE.XLSX, because that's what he was doing. He was paying out the rope he would eventually use to hang himself. And I was going to be the one to kick the chair away. I leaned forward and typed a single note next to the entry. Let him feel safe. If he thought he'd gotten away with the $25, he'd try for $200, then $2,000, then $20,000. And when he finally felt confident enough to make his big move, the move that would trigger the emergency guardianship petition to cover his tracks, I would be ready. I closed the laptop and looked at the photo of my grandmother on my desk. Game on, old man, I whispered to the empty room. Over the next 14 months, I watched the pattern unfold exactly as I'd predicted. $25.50 became $185, then $1,200, then $8,500, then $45,000. Each transaction was logged, cross-referenced, time-stamped. I built a database that would make the FBI jealous. IP addresses, device IDs, session logs. I knew which computer he used. I knew what time of day he preferred to steal. I knew his patterns better than he did. The total, as of 3 weeks ago, was $892,000. I also discovered something else. Richard was borrowing against his expected future inheritance. I found inquiries on his credit report from private lenders, the kind of people who don't advertise and don't forgive missed payments. He owed money to dangerous people, and he'd promised them he would have full control of the trust by the end of this month. That's why he filed the emergency petition. He wasn't trying to save me. He was trying to save himself. But in my obsession with tracking every detail, I made a mistake, a critical one. On March 15th, there was a transfer of $12,000. I was sick that week. The flu had knocked me flat for 5 days. In my fever haze, I logged the transaction late. I didn't cross-reference it immediately. I didn't verify the IP address in real time. I only discovered the gap in my records 2 days ago while preparing the final evidence binder for court. I sat at my desk at 3 a.m., staring at the entry, my stomach in knots. What if this breaks the timeline? What if Richard's lawyer claims coincidence? What if I'm not as thorough as I think I am? For the first time in 3 years, I felt genuine fear. I called Jessica at 7 a.m. I missed one, I said when she picked up. March 15th. I logged it a week late. Cross is going to use it against me. There was a pause. Sarah, Jessica said calmly. You're human. You got the flu. The bank's timestamp is immutable. It doesn't matter when you noticed it. We have your medical records from that week. It actually makes you more credible, not less. How? Because perfection is suspicious. Juries and judges don't trust perfect. They trust real. You're not a machine. You're a woman who got sick and still managed to catch her father stealing $892,000. That's the story. I exhaled. Okay, I said. Okay. But the doubt lingered. And as I sat in that courtroom watching Richard perform, I wondered, am I really as smart as I think? Or am I just another person playing a game I don't fully understand? Judge Hayes was waiting for an answer. Ms. Price, what is in that envelope? Jessica stood. She placed her hand on the manila envelope but didn't open it yet. She just held it there, letting the tension build. Your Honor, Jessica said, her voice crisp and professional. This envelope contains the rebuttal to every single claim Mr. Brennan has made. But more than that, it contains the reason why he is so desperate to control his daughter's finances. She paused. We are ready to proceed. I looked at the clock. 2:18 p.m. The countdown was over. The real trial was about to begin, and Richard Brennan had no idea that he was no longer the plaintiff. He was the prey. Jessica Price didn't move toward the envelope immediately. She was too smart for that. She understood that in a courtroom, anticipation is a weapon. Let them wonder. Let them sweat. Instead, she walked to the evidence table and picked up a different binder, a blue one, thick as a phone book. "Your Honor," Jessica began, "Mr. Brennan has painted a picture of a woman who cannot manage her own life. A woman so detached from reality that she squandered her inheritance through negligence and mental incapacity." She placed the binder on the podium with a deliberate thud. "But before we discuss where the money went, we need to establish who moved it, because in the digital age, every transaction leaves a fingerprint." Judge Hayes leaned forward slightly. I could see the shift in her posture, from skeptical observer to engaged adjudicator. "Ms. Price, are you suggesting the transactions were not made by your client?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor. I'm going to prove it." Jessica opened the binder. The first page was a detailed chart, columns of data that would look like gibberish to most people. But I knew what it said. I'd built it myself over hundreds of late nights. "This document," Jessica explained, "is a forensic audit of the trust account access history. Every time someone logs into the account and initiates a transfer, the bank's security protocols record specific information: the IP address, the device identifier, and the session timestamp." She turned the binder so Judge Hayes could see it clearly. "If you look at column A, you'll see a list of every login session that initiated a wire transfer over the last 14 months. Mr. Brennan claims that Sarah, in her erratic, unstable state, made these transfers." Jessica paused, letting the word erratic hang in the air with all its implications. "However, technology doesn't lie, and according to the bank's records, every single transfer was initiated from a device with a MAC address ending in F99. I stood up. It was my turn. Judge Hayes looked at me. "Ms. Brennan?" "Your Honor, I don't own a computer," I said. My voice was steady, clinical. I was in my element now. This was the work I did every day, just usually for other people's families. I do all my banking on my phone or in person at the branch. My phone is a 3-year-old Android model. Its unique device identifier, the MAC address, ends in B74. I pointed to the chart. If you look at the column labeled Device ID, you'll see that every transfer totaling $892,000 was initiated from device F99. That device is an Apple iMac Pro, registered to the network administrator of Brennan Real Estate Holdings. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that precedes an earthquake. Richard made a noise, a strangled sound, like a dog that had been kicked. "That proves nothing," he blurted out, gripping the edge of the table. "She uses my office. She comes in when I'm not there and uses the computers. She's trying to confuse you with technical nonsense." I didn't even look at him. I kept my eyes on Judge Hayes. "If you turn to Exhibit B, Your Honor," I continued, ignoring Richard's outburst, "you'll see a timeline correlation." Jessica flipped to the next section, a side-by-side comparison that I'd spent 3 days perfecting. "On the left," I explained, "you'll see the date and time of each wire transfer. On the right, you'll see my employment records from Sterling Records Management, including biometric entry logs." I pointed to a specific line. "The transfer on February 14th for $50,000 was executed at 10:14 in the morning. At 10:14 a.m. on February 14th, I was physically present at my workplace, logged into a secure server room that requires fingerprint authentication to access." I looked up at the judge. "The IP address that moved the money was traced to a location in Kingswell, 10 miles from my office. Unless I have the ability to be in 2 places at once, Your Honor, I could not have executed that transfer." Judge Hayes put on her reading glasses and examined the timeline herself. I watched her eyes move down the columns, cross-referencing dates and times. The courtroom held its breath. "Ms. Brennan," the judge said slowly, "you're telling me that for every significant transfer, and I'm looking at transfers ranging from $10,000 to $75,000, you have a verifiable alibi?" "Not every transfer, Your Honor," I said honestly. "The smaller amounts, under $5,000, occurred during evenings and weekends when I wasn't at work. I can't prove my location for those." Jessica shot me a look. We'd discussed this. Admitting the gaps made the rest more credible. However, I continued, for the 17 largest transfers, which account for over 90% of the total amount, I have time-stamped biometric proof that I was somewhere else when the money moved. William Cross stood up abruptly. His face was pale. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We were not provided with this evidence in discovery. This is trial by ambush. Judge Hayes turned to him with an expression that could freeze helium. Mr. Cross, you filed this as an emergency petition. You claimed the situation was so dire that standard timelines couldn't be followed. You specifically requested an expedited hearing. You don't get to complain now that the respondent is using the same compressed timeline to defend herself. Cross sat down, jaw clenched. But Richard wasn't done. He was standing now, his carefully constructed facade crumbling like wet cardboard. She gave me her passwords, he shouted. His face was turning that dangerous shade of purple I remembered from childhood, the color that meant someone was about to get hurt. She begged me to help her. She told me to move the money to keep it safe from the government. She's twisting everything. Judge Hayes banged her gavel once, sharp and commanding. Mr. Brennan, sit down or I will hold you in contempt. But I had one more nail to drive into the coffin. Mr. Brennan claims I gave him permission, I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. He claims he was acting as a benevolent father helping a confused daughter, but the bank requires two-factor authentication for any transfer over $10,000. They send a one-time passcode, an OTP, to a registered mobile number. I nodded to Jessica, who flipped to the next exhibit. If you look at Exhibit C, Your Honor, you'll see that the mobile number receiving these authentication codes was changed 3 days before the first large transfer. It was changed from my number, ending in 3847, to a prepaid phone number ending in 5599. I paused, letting that sink in. A burner phone is designed to be anonymous, Your Honor. That's why criminals use them, but even burner phones leave traces. Jessica handed a document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. I subpoenaed the carrier data for that number, I said. The phone was activated on January 10th, 3 years ago, and the billing address used to register the SIM card? I looked directly at Richard. 12 Oak Lane, my father's home address. The gasp from the gallery was audible. Aunt Patricia's hand flew to her mouth. Emily's eyes went wide. Even Tyler, who had been sitting with his arms crossed, clearly skeptical of my entire case, sat up straighter. Richard slammed his hand on the table. This is illegal, he screamed. You hacked my records. You're violating my privacy. Your Honor, I didn't hack anything, I said calmly. I filed a subpoena through proper legal channels, the kind of channels you would have used if you actually believed I was incompetent. He didn't deny it. He didn't say the phone wasn't his. He didn't claim the billing address was wrong. He screamed that I'd caught him. William Cross stood again. He was grasping at straws now, but he was a professional. He had to try. Ms. Brennan, Cross said, his tone sharp, you've presented a very detailed timeline, very precise, almost suspiciously precise. I said nothing, let him build his trap. In fact, Cross continued, walking toward the evidence table, you claim you've tracked every single transaction over 14 months, logged them all meticulously. Isn't that correct? That's correct. Cross picked up a printout, my own spreadsheet, which had been submitted as evidence. Then perhaps you can explain this. He placed the paper in front of Judge Hayes, pointing to a specific line. March 15th. A transfer of $12,000. According to the bank's records, this transaction occurred at 2:37 p.m. But according to your logs, Ms. Brennan, you didn't record this entry until March 22nd, a full week later. He turned to face me, a thin smile on his face. Did you fabricate this entry retroactively, or is your memory perhaps not as reliable as you claim? For a moment, I felt it, the flutter of panic in my chest, the doubt. The fear that I'd been so focused on building the perfect case that I'd overlooked the one imperfection that would destroy it all. But then I heard Jessica's voice in my head. Perfection is suspicious. Real is credible. I was ill that week, I said. I had the flu. I was running a fever of 103 degrees and couldn't get out of bed for 5 days. I looked at Cross directly. I logged the transaction late because I was physically incapable of logging it on time, but the bank's timestamp is immutable. The transaction happened when the bank says it happened, regardless of when I noticed it. Jessica stood. Your Honor, we have Ms. Brennan's medical records from her physician. She was diagnosed with influenza on March 13th and was advised to rest for a full week. We can provide those records if needed. Judge Hayes waved her hand. That won't be necessary. The bank's records stand as objective evidence regardless of when Ms. Brennan became aware of them. Mr. Cross, unless you're suggesting the bank fabricated their own transaction logs. Cross's shoulders sagged slightly. No, Your Honor. Then let's move on. I exhaled slowly. The mistake I'd been terrified of had become proof of my humanity. Jessica was right, but William Cross wasn't finished. If he couldn't discredit my timeline, he'd lean harder on the narrative of my instability. Your Honor, Cross said, returning to his table and picking up a document bound in a plastic cover. I'd like to submit additional evidence regarding Ms. Brennan's mental state. He walked to the bench and handed the document to Judge Hayes. This is a psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. James Sterling of Sterling Psychiatric Associates. Dr. Sterling treated Ms. Brennan for approximately 6 months and has documented a pattern of severe paranoid ideation, missed appointments, and episodes of manic behavior. I felt Jessica tense beside me, but I put a hand on her arm. Not yet. Judge Hayes examined the document. This evaluation claims Ms. Brennan confessed to hearing voices, that she exhibited signs of dissociative episodes. Yes, Your Honor, Cross said. It's all documented in Dr. Sterling's notes. I leaned forward slightly, reading the letterhead from across the room. Sterling Psychiatric Associates, 4200, Oak Park Boulevard, Suite 300, license number, PSY 47829. My pulse quickened, but not with fear, with the thrill of recognition. I whispered to Jessica, "The doctor doesn't exist." She looked at me sharply. Are you sure? I'd bet my life on it. The license number was wrong. In our state, psychiatrists, medical doctors who can prescribe medication, are licensed with the prefix M.D. or D.O. The prefix P.S.Y. is used for psychologists in the neighboring state of Oregon, and they can't diagnose medical conditions or prescribe medication the way this report claimed. More than that, I knew the address. 4200 Oak Park Boulevard was a virtual office building. I'd investigated a shell company that used the same address last year. You could rent a mailbox there for $50 a month and put any business name you wanted on it. There was no medical office at that address. There were no examination rooms, no waiting area, no receptionist, just a wall of brass mailboxes in a lobby that smelled like printer toner. But Jessica was right. We had to let them enter it into evidence first. Once it was officially part of the record, contesting it would carry more weight. Your Honor, Jessica said carefully, we'll need time to review the provenance of this document, but for now, we'll reserve our objections. Cross looked surprised. He'd expected us to fight it immediately. When we didn't, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Judge Hayes looked at the document again, then at me. Ms. Brennan, according to this evaluation, you've been under psychiatric care for some time. Is that accurate? I stood. No, Your Honor. I've never met Dr. James Sterling. I've never been a patient at Sterling Psychiatric Associates. Denial is a common symptom, Cross interjected smoothly. Your Honor, it's well documented that patients suffering from paranoid delusions often— Mr. Cross, Judge Hayes interrupted. I'll determine what is and isn't relevant. Right now, I'm trying to establish basic facts. She looked at me again. You're certain you've never met this doctor? I'm certain, Your Honor. In fact, I'm certain he doesn't exist. That got everyone's attention. Cross laughed, a short, nervous bark. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of paranoid ideation Dr. Sterling documented. Ms. Brennan believes anyone who contradicts her narrative must be part of a conspiracy. The address on the letterhead is a virtual mailbox, I said calmly. Suite 300 at 4200 Oak Park Boulevard is not a medical office. It's a mail forwarding service. You can rent a mailbox there for $50 a month. I pulled out my phone. I'd already looked this up during Richard's opening statement and navigated to the building's website. Here's the rate sheet. Basic mailbox, $50 per month. Professional address for business cards, $75 per month. They'll even answer your phone calls with whatever business name you choose. William Cross's face went pale. Furthermore, I continued, the license number on the letterhead PSY 47829 is not a valid psychiatrist license in this state. PSY is the prefix used for licensed psychologists in Oregon, not medical psychiatrists in our state. A real psychiatrist here would have an MD or DO license number. Judge Hayes picked up the document again, examining it more closely. Mr. Cross, did you verify this doctor's credentials before submitting this evaluation? Cross opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I received this document from my client's office. I was told it was. I assumed it had been properly vetted. I had no reason to believe. You had no reason to believe it was fraudulent. Judge Hayes finished for him, her tone icy. Or you had no reason to verify it because you wanted it to be true. During the brief recess, Judge Hayes called to examine the questionable medical document more closely. I stepped into the hallway. I needed air. I needed distance from the concentrated hatred radiating off Richard like heat from asphalt in summer. Patricia was there, leaning against the wall, clutching her purse. When she saw me, her face crumpled. "Sarah," she said, her voice breaking. "Sarah, please. He loves you. He's your father. Can't you just let him help? Why does it have to be like this?" I looked at her, really looked at her. She was 58 years old and she looked 70. Years of enabling had carved lines into her face that no amount of expensive face cream could erase. "He lies about me, Aunt Patricia," I said quietly. "He tells people I'm sick when I'm not. He steals from me and calls it protection. That's not love." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "Does it matter? He's family. Just let him be the dad. It's easier that way. For everyone." "Easier for who?" She flinched at my tone. "You want me to lie down and let him steamroll me because it makes your life more comfortable? Because if I fight back, you have to choose sides. And choosing sides means you might have to admit you've been wrong for 20 years. That's not fair." "None of this is fair, Aunt Patricia. But I'm not setting myself on fire to keep you warm anymore." Tyler appeared from around the corner, his face flushed with anger. "You know what you're doing to him?" Tyler said, jabbing a finger toward the courtroom. "He's your father, Sarah, making him uncomfortable, calling him out in public. That's not abuse. That's you being dramatic." I turned to face my cousin. Tyler had always been Richard's golden child, the son Richard never had. "He stole almost $1 million from me, Tyler. So he moved some money around. He was managing it. That's what trustees do. He created a fake doctor to declare me mentally incompetent." Tyler hesitated, but only for a second. "You don't know that. That could be a misunderstanding, some paperwork mix-up." I looked at him and realized Tyler didn't want the truth. He wanted the comfortable lie. Because if Richard was a monster, then Tyler had been worshiping a monster for 30 years. Some people can't afford the truth. It costs too much. But Emily approached from the other direction. My younger cousin, quiet, always in the background. She'd been crying. "Is it true?" Emily asked. "All of it?" "Yes." She looked down at her hands. "I saw things, over the years. Little things that didn't make sense. The way he talked about you when you weren't around. How he'd smile when he told stories that made you look bad. I thought I was imagining it." "You weren't." Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough." I reached out and squeezed her hand. "You see it now. That's what matters." The bailiff appeared in the doorway. "Court's resuming in 2 minutes." Back in the courtroom, Richard was no longer sitting calmly. He was pacing behind the defense table, whispering urgently to William Cross. Cross kept shaking his head, trying to calm him down, but Richard was spiraling. Judge Hayes returned to the bench. "Mr. Cross, I've examined the medical evaluation more closely. The license number is indeed invalid for this state. The address appears to be a mail forwarding service. Do you wish to withdraw this document?" Cross stood slowly. He looked at Richard, then at the judge. "Your Honor, I was provided this document by my client. I relied on his representation that it was legitimate. If there are questions about its authenticity, I would request time to— To what, Mr. Cross? To find the fictional Dr. Sterling and ask him to materialize? Cross's jaw tightened. He was realizing in real time that his client had lied to him, and that lie was going to cost him his reputation, possibly his license. Your Honor, Cross said carefully, I would like to request a brief recess to consult with my client about the source of this document. Denied. You've had 3 weeks since filing this petition to verify your evidence. Sit down. Judge Hayes turned her attention to Richard. Mr. Brennan, where did you obtain this psychological evaluation? Richard's hands were shaking. I could see them from across the room. He gripped the table to steady them. It was provided to me by the doctor's office. They sent it directly. You have correspondence from this office? It was a phone conversation. They said they'd mail the report. To where? To my office. So you received a medical evaluation in the mail from a doctor you'd never met, regarding a daughter you claim is paranoid and delusional, and you didn't think to verify the doctor's credentials. Richard opened his mouth. No sound came out. Judge Hayes leaned forward. Or did you know Dr. Sterling doesn't exist, mister? Brennan, did you fabricate this document? Before Richard could answer, or refuse to answer, William Cross pivoted desperately to his strongest remaining argument, the money. Your Honor, regardless of questions about the medical evaluation, the fundamental issue remains. Ms. Brennan's trust fund has been depleted. Nearly $892,000 is gone. The bank statements are clear. He placed a stack of statements on the bench. There are no assets to show for it. No property purchased, no investments made. Just cash withdrawals and wire transfers to untraceable accounts. Whether or not Ms. Brennan is mentally ill, she has demonstrably failed to protect her inheritance. Judge Hayes examined the statements. I watched her face as she flipped through page after page of red ink. The balance on the most recent statement was, indeed, 0. The courtroom murmured. I heard someone behind me, probably one of the distant relatives who'd shown up for the drama, whisper, She really did spend it all. Judge Hayes looked up at me. Ms. Brennan, your father's counsel is correct. According to these bank statements, the trust account currently has a balance of $0. The records show $892,000 in outgoing transfers over 14 months. Do you have an explanation for where this money went? This was the moment, the trap within the trap. If I claimed the money was stolen but couldn't prove where it went, I looked incompetent. If I admitted I didn't know, I looked unstable. If I got emotional, I looked erratic. I stood up slowly. I do not have an explanation, Your Honor. The shock that rippled through the courtroom was palpable. Patricia gasped. Tyler shook his head. Even Emily looked confused. Richard's face transformed. The panic drained away, replaced by a triumphant smirk. He thought I'd just admitted defeat. He thought the game was over. William Cross actually closed his folder, but I wasn't finished. I do not have an explanation, I repeated, because an explanation is a story. And I don't deal in stories, Your Honor. I deal in trails. I nodded to Jessica. Jessica stood and picked up the manila envelope, the one we'd placed on the table at the beginning of the hearing, the one everyone had been wondering about for the past hour. She broke the red seal. Your Honor, Jessica said, her voice clear and strong. Mr. Brennan has spent the last 90 minutes telling you what he thinks happened. He's constructed a narrative about an unstable daughter who squandered her inheritance. She pulled out a thick stack of documents from the envelope. But courts don't rule on narratives. They rule on evidence. And evidence, Your Honor, is what we have here. She walked to the bench and handed the first binder to Judge Hayes. This binder contains a complete forensic audit of the trust account conducted by Ms. Brennan herself over the course of 14 months. It includes IP addresses, device identifiers, session timestamps, and cross-referenced location data. Jessica turned to face the courtroom. Every dollar that left that account can be traced. Every transaction has a digital fingerprint, and not one of those fingerprints belongs to Sarah Brennan. She handed a second binder to the bailiff for William Cross. Mr. Brennan claims his daughter squandered the money through incompetence. but the evidence shows that the money was systematically transferred to a shell corporation called Apex Consulting Group, a Delaware LLC with no physical address, no employees, and no legitimate business operations. Jessica pulled out another document. And the registered agent for Apex Consulting Group, a corporate formation service that specializes in anonymous business entities, but the banking records show that all funds deposited into Apex Consulting were immediately transferred to personal accounts. She paused. Accounts controlled by Richard Brennan. The courtroom erupted. Richard shot to his feet. That's a lie! She's making this up! I'm not making anything up, I said calmly, my voice cutting through the chaos. I have 14 months of bank records, wire transfer receipts, corporate registration documents, tax filings, every piece of paper trail your shell company left behind. I looked at Richard. You thought I was too unstable to notice $25.50. You thought I was too broken to track $892,000. You thought you could gaslight me into believing I was crazy while you stole my inheritance. I picked up the evidence binder and held it up. But you forgot something, Dad. Documents don't have feelings. You can't gaslight a bank statement. You can't manipulate a timestamp. And you can't emotionally abuse a forensic audit. Judge Hayes banged her gavel, trying to restore order, but the damage was done. The narrative had shifted. The victim was now the prosecutor. The concerned father was now the accused. And the unstable daughter was now the woman holding the smoking gun. Patricia was staring at Richard with her mouth open. Emily had tears streaming down her face. Tyler looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. And Richard looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the ground crumble beneath his feet. Jessica placed the final piece of evidence on the judge's bench. Your Honor, we're not asking you to take our word for it. Every document in this binder can be independently verified. Every bank record has a corresponding entry in the financial institution's database. Every transfer has a paper trail. She looked at Richard. The only question now is whether Mr. Brennan will continue to lie, or whether he'll finally tell the truth about where the money really went. Judge Hayes picked up the evidence binder. She began reading, her expression growing darker with each page. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of pages turning. And in that silence, I watched Richard Brennan realize that the cage I'd spent 3 years building had finally, irrevocably, closed around him. Judge Hayes didn't look up from the evidence binder for a full 3 minutes. In a courtroom, 3 minutes of silence feels like an eternity. The only sound was the whisper of pages turning and the occasional shuffle of feet from the gallery. When she finally closed the binder, her expression was carved from granite. Mr. Brennan, Judge Hayes said, her voice cold enough to frost glass. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I strongly suggest you think very carefully before answering. Richard was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. A thin sheen of sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the courtroom's aggressive air conditioning. Did you authorize the creation of Apex Consulting Group? William Cross put a hand on Richard's arm, whispering urgently, but Richard shook him off. That's a business entity. I have dozens of business entities. I can't be expected to remember every LLC I've ever... That's not what I asked. Did you authorize its creation? Yes or no? Richard's jaw worked furiously. I don't recall. You don't recall authorizing a Delaware LLC that received nearly $900,000 from your daughter's trust fund? I'd have to check my records. Mr. Brennan, I'm not asking about records. I'm asking if you, personally, created or authorized the creation of this shell company for the purpose of receiving funds from a trust over which you had administrative oversight. The trap was perfect. If he said yes, he admitted to self-dealing. If he said no, the paper trail would prove he was lying. If he continued to claim he didn't recall, he looked guilty. Richard opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Jessica Price stood up. Your Honor, before Mr. Brennan answers, there's one more witness we'd like to call. Someone who can provide direct testimony about how Apex Consulting Group was created and who authorized it. Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow. This witness wasn't on your preliminary list, Ms. Price. No, Your Honor. He came forward only last week. after he was fired from Brennan Real Estate Holdings for refusing to participate in what he believed was fraudulent activity. Richard's head snapped up, his face drained of all color. "Objection!" William Cross shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We haven't had time to prepare. This witness should have been disclosed. You filed this as an emergency petition, Mr. Cross," Judge Hayes said, her patience clearly wearing thin. "You claimed time was of the essence. You specifically requested we bypass standard discovery timelines. You don't get to complain now that the respondent is using the same expedited process." She looked at Jessica. "Who is this witness?" "David Turner, Your Honor, Mr. Brennan's former executive administrative assistant." I watched Richard carefully. At the mention of David's name, something flickered across his face. It wasn't just anger or fear. It was something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition. Guilt. "Traitor," Richard hissed under his breath. But in the silence of the courtroom, everyone heard it. The bailiff opened the rear doors of the courtroom. David Turner walked in, and I saw him with fresh eyes. I'd met with him 3 times over the past 4 months, always in coffee shops far from Kingswell, always carefully documenting every conversation. I knew his story. I knew what he was about to do. But watching him walk down that aisle toward the father who'd abandoned him before he was born, I wondered if I'd made a mistake, if I'd weaponized someone else's pain for my own purposes. David was 26 years old, wearing a suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders, probably borrowed. He was pale, nervous, clutching a leather satchel to his chest like armor. His dark hair was neatly combed, but I could see his hands shaking slightly. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at Richard. He kept his eyes fixed on the witness stand, moving forward with the grim determination of a man walking toward a firing squad. As he passed the family pews, Patricia physically leaned away from him, as if proximity to a disgruntled employee might be contagious. Tyler watched him with open contempt, but Emily's eyes were wide, curious. David reached the witness stand. The bailiff held out a Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." His voice was quiet, but steady. He sat down, placed the satchel on his lap, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, he looked directly at Richard Brennan. The look that passed between them lasted only a second, but it carried the weight of 26 years of abandonment. Jessica approached the witness stand. "Please state your name and occupation for the record." "David Turner. I was employed as the executive administrative assistant to Richard Brennan at Brennan Real Estate Holdings for 3 years. I was terminated 3 weeks ago." "And what reason were you given for your termination?" David's mouth tightened. "Gross incompetence. Specifically, I was told I'd made critical errors in document management that put the company at legal risk." "Had you made such errors?" "No. I was fired because I refused to backdate a lease agreement Mr. Brennan wanted to submit to a tenant dispute arbitration." William Cross stood. "Objection. This has nothing to do with the guardianship petition." "It goes to character, Your Honor," Jessica said. "Mr. Brennan has portrayed himself as a concerned father making difficult decisions for his daughter's welfare. His treatment of his employees speaks to his pattern of behavior when people refuse to help him bend the rules." Judge Hayes nodded. "Overruled. Continue, Ms. Price." Jessica picked up the fake medical evaluation, the document William Cross had submitted earlier. "Mr. Turner, are you familiar with this document?" David looked at it. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Yes." "Where have you seen it before?" "I wrote it." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs as people stood up to see better. Judge Hayes banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! I will have order!" Richard was on his feet, pointing at David with a shaking hand. "He's a liar! Your Honor, he's a disgruntled employee. I fired him for theft. He's making this up to get back at me. Mr. Brennan, sit down." Judge Hayes's voice cracked like thunder. "This is your final warning. One more outburst and you'll be removed from this courtroom." Richard sank back into his chair, but his chest was heaving. He looked like a cornered animal. Jessica waited for silence before continuing. Mr. Turner, you just stated you wrote this psychological evaluation. You're not a doctor. Why would you write a psychiatric assessment? David took a breath. When he spoke, his voice was stronger. Because Mr. Brennan told me to. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a stack of papers, photocopies, but clearly labeled and organized. He emailed me a template. He said he'd found it online. He dictated the symptoms to me while I typed paranoia, instability, manic episodes. He told me to use those exact words. And the doctor's name? James Sterling. Mr. Brennan made it up. He said it sounded distinguished, like someone people would trust. David's hands were steadier now. He was finding his rhythm. He told me to buy a logo from a stock image site, one of those generic medical symbols, and create letterhead. He even gave me the address to use, 4200 Oak Park Boulevard. He knew it was a virtual office because he'd used it before for other shell companies. William Cross was on his feet again, but he looked less like a shark now and more like a drowning man. Objection! Your Honor, this is hearsay. This witness claims my client instructed him, but he has no proof of these conversations. This is just his word against a respected businessman. Do you have proof, Mr. Turner? Judge Hayes asked. David nodded. He handed several sheets of paper to the bailiff. I wasn't supposed to keep this. Mr. Brennan told me to delete the email chain and wipe it from the server, but I forwarded the emails to my personal account before I left that day. I knew this was illegal. I knew it was fraud, and I was scared he'd blame me if it ever came out. The bailiff handed the documents to Judge Hayes. She read them in silence. Her face grew darker with each line. When she finished, she looked up and read aloud. Subject: the doctor letter, from Richard Brennan to David Turner. Date: January 12th, 10:30 a.m. She paused, her voice dripping with contempt. David, use the template attached. Make it sound professional. Focus on the instability. The judge needs a story. Print it on heavy bond paper so it looks official. Send it to Cross by Friday. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Hayes looked at William Cross. Mr. Cross, did you receive this document from Mr. Brennan's office, or did you receive it directly from Dr. Sterling's practice? Cross's face had gone ashen. He was realizing in real time that he'd submitted forged evidence to the court, that his license was on the line, that his client had used him as an unwitting accomplice in fraud. I received it via courier from Mr. Brennan's office, Cross said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was told it was a copy of an original held by the medical practice. I assumed. I had no reason to believe. You had no reason to believe it was fraudulent. Judge Hayes finished icily. Because you didn't bother to verify it. Because verification might have been inconvenient. She set the email down. Mr. Cross, we'll discuss your professional obligations in chambers after this hearing. For now, sit down. Richard was shaking his head, muttering to himself. I could see his lips moving. No, no, no. He looked at David with something that might have been recognition, or might have been horror. Jessica continued her questioning. Mr. Turner, you took a significant risk keeping these emails. You risked your job, which you ultimately lost. Why did you do it? David was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Harder. Because I wanted to understand him. I wanted to understand the kind of man who could do this to his own daughter. He looked directly at Richard. I wanted to understand the kind of man who could throw away his own son. The courtroom went silent again, but this silence was different. Confused. Electric. Patricia leaned forward in her seat. Emily's mouth fell open. Tyler's eyes went wide. Richard's face transformed, from angry to terrified in the space of a heartbeat. What? Richard managed to choke out. What are you? That's insane! I don't know what you're… David reached into his satchel again. This time, he pulled out a photograph. Old, faded, creased from being carried in a wallet for too long. My mother is Catherine Turner, David said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. You had an affair with her 27 years ago. She was 22, your secretary. He held up the photograph so the courtroom could see it, a younger Richard with his arm around a young woman, both smiling at the camera. When she got pregnant, you paid her $10,000 to disappear. You told her if she ever contacted you again, you'd destroy her reputation. You'd make sure she never worked in this town again. Patricia stood up, her hand over her mouth. Richard, is this true? Richard was shaking his head frantically. I don't know any Catherine. This is ridiculous. He's making this up. The back of the photograph is dated, David continued, turning it over. June 1998. There's a notation in your handwriting. K, Santa Barbara, weekend. He handed the photograph to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Hayes. I didn't take this job for money, Mr. Brennan, David said, and for the first time I heard real emotion crack through his controlled facade. I took it to understand you. I stayed because I wanted to see who you really were. What kind of man abandons his own child and then, 26 years later, tries to destroy his daughter? Son, David's hands were shaking now, but his voice remained steady. I wanted to know if you were worth knowing. If there was some reason, some excuse, for what you did to my mother, for what you did to me, he paused. And I found out. You're exactly who I thought you'd be. You're a man who thinks love is control, who thinks family is property, who destroys anyone who doesn't submit to your version of reality. Jessica let the moment breathe before asking her next question. Mr. Turner, when did you first make contact with Sarah Brennan? 4 months ago. She'd run a background check on me, standard procedure for her work. She discovered my mother's name on my employment application and cross-referenced it with old records from Brennan Real Estate. David looked at me for the first time since taking the stand. She figured out who I was before I told anyone. She called me and asked if I wanted justice or revenge. I felt the weight of his gaze. The implicit question, did I make the right choice? What did you tell her? Jessica asked. I told her I wanted both. David reached into his satchel one more time and pulled out a USB drive. Mr. Brennan told me to wipe the servers before I left. Delete all evidence of the emails, the fake documents, the shell company formations. But I didn't just forward emails to myself. He held up the drive. I copied everything, every deleted file, every confidential document he thought was destroyed. 3 years of evidence showing how he systematically defrauded not just his daughter, but multiple clients, family members, and business partners. William Cross put his head in his hands. I didn't fabricate anything, David said, his voice stronger now. I didn't create false evidence. I just stopped protecting him. I stopped deleting the proof of what he was. Judge Hayes took the USB drive from the bailiff. Mr. Turner, I need to ask you directly. Is there any evidence on this drive that you altered, fabricated, or obtained through illegal means? No, Your Honor. Everything on that drive was created by Mr. Brennan or his business associates. I had authorized access to all company files as his executive assistant. I copied them before my termination. Jessica nodded. Your Honor, we'd like to submit this drive as evidence and request the court's IT department verify its contents. Granted, we'll take a brief recess while that happens. But before Judge Hayes could stand, Richard exploded. You bastard! Richard screamed, lunging toward the witness stand. The bailiff moved to intercept, but Richard wasn't trying to physically reach David. He was just unraveling. The careful mask he'd worn for 62 years was cracking apart. I gave you a job! Richard shouted, spittle flying from his lips. I gave you opportunities! I could have had you arrested! You could have been a father, David said quietly. The simple statement hit harder than any accusation. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. You think you can come into my courtroom and destroy my family with your lies? You're nothing. You're a mistake. Your mother was a Mr. Brennan. Judge Hayes' gavel cracked down. That is enough! But Richard was beyond reason now. He turned his rage on David with the full force of 26 years of denied responsibility. I will ruin you! Richard pointed a shaking finger at David. You think you can testify against me? I know where you live. I know where your mother lives. I will make sure neither of you ever— Mr. Brennan! Judge Hayes was standing now, her face flushed with fury. Did you just threaten a witness? In my courtroom? On the record? She turned to the court reporter. Did you get that? The court reporter, wide-eyed, nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Every word. Judge Hayes looked at the bailiff. Deputy, secure the respondent. The bailiff moved toward Richard, one hand on his handcuffs. Richard backed away, knocking his chair over. No, wait! This is a civil proceeding. You can't arrest me in civil court. I have rights. You had rights, Mr. Brennan. Then you committed witness intimidation in front of a judge. You made terroristic threats on the record. This ceased being a simple guardianship hearing the moment you opened your mouth. She looked out at the gallery. I'm declaring a mistrial on the guardianship petition with prejudice, meaning it cannot be refiled, but I am not dismissing the parties from this courtroom. The bailiff had reached Richard now, handcuffs in hand. But before he could secure Richard's wrists, Jessica's phone buzzed on the table. A single, short vibration. She looked down at the screen. Read the message, looked up at me, and gave a single, sharp nod. It was the signal. Your Honor, Jessica said, standing. Before you take Mr. Brennan into custody, there's one more party who wishes to be heard. Judge Hayes looked confused. I didn't approve any other interveners, Ms. Price. Who? The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man walked in. He wasn't a bailiff. He wasn't a local police officer. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He moved with fluid, dangerous grace, the kind that comes from years of tactical training. He held a leather badge wallet in his left hand, raised high enough for everyone to see. Behind him, 2 other agents in windbreakers marked FBI stepped into the room, flanking the doors. Federal Agent Thomas Miller walked straight down the center aisle. He didn't look at the family. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at Richard Brennan. Judge Hayes's expression shifted from anger to shock to grim understanding. She recognized federal jurisdiction when she saw it. Agent Miller stopped at the gate separating the gallery from the court floor. Federal Agent Thomas Miller, Financial Crimes Division, he said. His voice was calm, deep, authoritative. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. He looked at Richard. But we've been monitoring wire transfers from Brennan real estate escrow accounts for 6 months. We were waiting for the final link in the chain. We needed to know who was controlling the Apex Consulting shell accounts. He gestured to the evidence binders on Jessica's table. I believe Ms. Brennan and her counsel have just provided that link for the record. Richard made a sound like a wounded animal. No, 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 no! Patricia was staring at her brother with absolute horror. Emily was crying. Tyler looked like he'd been slapped. But I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't Deus ex machina. Because 3 months ago, I'd sat in a coffee shop in the next county with Agent Miller and a federal prosecutor, and I'd made them a deal. The coffee shop was called Grounds for Appeal, a lawyer joke that always made me smile. I sat in the back corner, facing the door. Old habit. Agent Miller arrived exactly on time, accompanied by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Walsh. They slid into the booth across from me. Ms. Brennan, Miller said, you said you had information about a multi-state fraud scheme? I'd slid a USB drive across the table. Richard Brennan has been operating shell companies across 4 states. He's been embezzling from client escrow accounts, falsifying property valuations, and conducting wire fraud. The trust fund theft is just the tip of the iceberg. Miller examined the drive. How'd you get this? I'm a forensic fraud investigator. It's what I do. Everything on that drive was obtained legally. Public records, subpoenaed documents, voluntary testimony from former employees. Why not just report this to local authorities? Walsh had leaned forward. Because you want something in exchange. I want time, I'd said. Richard's planning to file for emergency guardianship. He needs to make his move to pay off his debts. If you arrest him now, you'll get him for the trust theft. But if you wait, if you let him file the petition and present his fraudulent evidence in court, you'll get him for fraud upon the court, witness intimidation, and you'll have everything documented by a court reporter. Miller frowned. You're asking us to let a crime unfold. I'm asking you to let him hang himself with his own rope. He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks his position in the community protects him. Let him prove he's not above the law in the one place that matters, in front of a judge. Walsh and Miller exchanged glances. We'd need to monitor the situation, Miller said. If you're in danger. I'm not in danger. I'm the one building the cage. Miller had studied me for a long moment. Then he'd pocketed the USB drive. We'll wait, but the moment I think this is going sideways, we're intervening. Fair enough. Agent Miller stepped through the gate into the court floor. Ms. Brennan contacted our office 3 months ago, Miller explained to Judge Hayes. She provided evidence of wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering across state lines. We've been building a federal case. He looked at Richard. We were waiting to see how far he'd go, how much damage he was willing to do to avoid consequences. Richard was shaking his head, backing away from the bailiff. Sarah, please, tell them this is a mistake. I'm your father. You can't let them take me. I looked at him. I felt Jessica's hand on my arm. A silent question. Are you okay? I stood up. Dad, I said quietly. Richard's eyes lit up with desperate hope. He thought I was about to save him. Even now, even after everything, he thought his daughter would protect him. You spent 20 years telling everyone I was crazy. You made them believe I couldn't trust my own mind. You stole my inheritance and tried to steal my freedom. I paused. But you forgot one thing. I'm not crazy. I'm just surrounded by people who needed me to be. Agent Miller pulled out handcuffs. Richard Brennan, you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, bank fraud, and money laundering. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. Richard wasn't screaming anymore. He was just empty, deflated, a balloon with all the air let out. You can't do this, he whispered. I'm your father. No, I said. You're the man who was supposed to be my father. There's a difference. But before the FBI agents could lead Richard away, William Cross stood up. He looked haggard, desperate. Your Honor, Cross said, his voice cracking. Before federal custody is taken, there's one more matter from the civil case that needs to be addressed. Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow. Mr. Cross, I've already declared a mistrial. The general power of attorney, Your Honor. My client maintains that he had legal authority to manage the trust because Mrs. Brennan signed a comprehensive power of attorney granting him full authority. Cross pulled out a document, the one Richard had waved earlier, the one he'd tried to use as his trump card. If this document is valid, then technically Mr. Brennan's actions, while perhaps unethical, were not illegal under civil law. He was acting as an authorized agent. Agent Miller frowned. That's for a civil court to determine. It doesn't affect the federal charges. But it affects the narrative, Cross insisted. He was grasping at straws, trying to give Richard something, anything to hold on to. If she gave him permission, then the story changes. Judge Hayes sighed. Fine, let's resolve this. Ms. Brennan, your father claims you signed a general power of attorney granting him authority over your estate. Is that document legitimate? I stood. May I examine it, Your Honor? The bailiff brought me the document. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the paper quality, the texture. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was mine, the distinctive loop of the S, the sharp angle of the B in Brennan. No question. Richard, even in handcuffs, managed a weak smile. Tell them, Sarah. Tell them you signed it. I looked at him. You're right, Dad. This is my signature. Relief flooded his face. But I didn't write it on this piece of paper. I turned the document over, examining the back. When I sign legal documents, I press hard, force of habit from my work. You can always feel the indentation on the back of the page. I ran my finger over the reverse side. This is smooth, completely smooth, no indentation. I held the signature up to the light. Furthermore, if you look closely at the ink density, the signature is pixelated at the edges. It's a high-resolution scan, but it's still a copy. The rest of the text, the body granting you power of attorney, is crisp laser print. I handed the document to Judge Hayes. This is a transposition forgery, Your Honor. My father took a signature from a different document, likely one of the funeral authorization forms I signed 3 years ago, scanned it, and digitally pasted it onto this power of attorney. Jessica already had the comparison ready. She placed the original funeral home documents next to the alleged power of attorney. If you overlay the signatures, Jessica explained, you'll find they're a 100% match. Every loop, every slant, every microscopic detail. Identical. Judge Hayes examined both documents under the courtroom's task light. No person signs their name exactly the same way twice, I said. There are always microscopic variations in pressure, angle, speed. It's biologically impossible to produce two identical signatures by hand. I looked at Richard. Unless it's a photocopy. Judge Hayes set the documents down. She looked at Richard with something beyond anger now. It was contempt. Mr. Brennan, you've submitted forged medical documents and now a forged legal instrument. You've committed perjury, fraud upon the court, and witness intimidation. She turned to Agent Miller. He's all yours. The agents began leading Richard toward the side exit, the one that led to the holding cells. As they passed the gallery, Richard looked back at his family one last time. Patricia was sobbing into her hands. Emily's face was streaked with tears, but she wasn't looking away. She was watching, witnessing, finally seeing. Tyler's arms were crossed, his face a mask of confusion and betrayal. And Richard looked at me. "I hope you're happy," he spat. "You've destroyed this family. For what? For money? For revenge?" I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said finally. "For the truth. The family didn't collapse because of me, Dad. It collapsed because you built it on lies. I just brought the tide." The doors closed behind him with a heavy thud. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Then Judge Hayes cleared her throat. "Ms. Brennan, there's still the matter of the trust itself. With Mr. Brennan removed as trustee and facing federal charges, the court needs to appoint an independent fiduciary to manage the assets until a permanent solution is found." She paused. "However, I understand from the trust documents that there may be additional provisions that are relevant to this situation?" Jessica nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. There's a clause in Eleanor Brennan's trust that specifically addresses this scenario." "What kind of clause?" Jessica pulled out the original trust document, yellowed slightly at the edges but carefully preserved. "It's called the Capacity Challenge Clause, Your Honor, and it was designed exactly for this moment." Judge Hayes leaned forward. "Explain." Eleanor Brennan anticipated that her son might try exactly what he tried today. She wrote into the trust that if anyone initiated legal proceedings to declare Sarah mentally incompetent and those proceedings were found to be baseless or supported by fraudulent evidence, Jessica paused, then that person would immediately and irrevocably forfeit all rights, titles, and interests in the trust. The courtroom went completely silent. I looked at the family. Patricia had stopped crying. She was just staring at the bench, processing. Emily's eyes were wide. Tyler looked like he'd been punched in the stomach, and in that moment, I realized that my grandmother, sharp, brilliant Eleanor, had set one final trap. Not for me. For the man who thought he could control everything. Jessica held the trust document with both hands, as if it were something sacred. In a way, I suppose it was. My grandmother's final act of protection, written in legalese and notary seals instead of hugs and whispered encouragement. "Your Honor," Jessica said, "with the court's permission, I'd like to read the relevant section in full. Article 9, Section 4, Paragraph C. The Capacity Challenge Clause." Judge Hayes nodded. "Proceed." Jessica's voice was clear and measured. "In the event that any trustee or beneficiary initiates legal proceedings to declare the primary beneficiary, Sarah Brennan, mentally incompetent or incapacitated, and such proceedings are found by a court of law to be baseless, malicious, or supported by falsified evidence, then the initiating party shall immediately and irrevocably forfeit all rights, titles, and interests in this trust." She paused, letting the words settle over the courtroom like snow. "Furthermore, any position of authority held by said party shall be terminated instantly, and any beneficial interest they hold shall be transferred as specified in the forfeiture distribution provisions outlined in paragraph D." Patricia made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. Jessica continued. "The intent of this clause is to prevent family members from using the court system as a tool of coercion or control against the primary beneficiary. If the primary beneficiary is found to be competent and the challenge is found to be made in bad faith, the challenger is deemed to have acted with malicious intent and is removed permanently from any position of trust or benefit. I watched the realization wash over the courtroom. Tyler's mouth fell open. Even Emily, who had started to shift to my side, looked shocked. And Patricia looked like someone had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. "That can't be legal," Tyler said, standing up. "You can't just write someone out of a will because they—" "Sit down, young man," Judge Hayes said sharply. "This is an in terrorem clause, and it's perfectly legal in this state when properly executed. Your grandmother had every right to protect her granddaughter from predatory behavior." She turned to Jessica. "What are the forfeiture distribution provisions?" "That's where it gets complicated, Your Honor." Jessica flipped to the next page of the trust document. Eleanor Brennan included a secondary provision that I've never seen in any trust document before. She called it the mercy provision. Jessica began to read again, but this time her voice held something else. Admiration, maybe. Or sorrow. Paragraph D. Forfeiture distribution provisions. In the event that paragraph C is triggered, the primary beneficiary, Sarah Brennan, shall be presented with two paths. Jessica looked up at me. I felt my pulse quicken. Path A, complete forfeiture. All of the challenger's interests in this trust, including any future inheritance, trustee fees, and beneficial shares, shall be transferred in their entirety to the Lighthouse Foundation for At-Risk Youth, an organization dedicated to helping children escape abusive family situations. Patricia let out a choked sob. Path B, partial forfeiture. 50% of the challenger's interest shall be transferred to the Lighthouse Foundation. The remaining 50% shall be held in a restricted trust for the challenger's benefit, with the following conditions. First, the primary beneficiary must certify in writing, under penalty of perjury, that she believes the challenger acted out of genuine, if misguided, concern for her welfare, and not out of malice, greed, or desire for control. Second, the challenger must complete a minimum of 100 hours of therapy focused on family dynamics and emotional abuse, with progress reports submitted to an independent trustee. Third, the challenger must make no contact with the primary beneficiary for a period of no less than 2 years, unless the primary beneficiary initiates such contact. Jessica set the document down. The choice of which path to take rests solely with Sarah Brennan. She must make this decision within 30 days of the triggering event. Judge Hayes looked at me. "Ms. Brennan, do you understand what this means?" I nodded slowly. My throat felt tight. My grandmother had given me ultimate power over Richard's future, but she'd also given me an impossible choice. Complete destruction, righteous, justified, satisfying, or partial mercy, contingent on me declaring under oath that I believed Richard had acted out of genuine concern rather than malice, and I would have to lie to choose mercy. Because Richard had not acted out of concern, he'd acted out of greed, desperation, and a pathological need to control. I knew that. Eleanor knew that. But she'd built in the option anyway. Why? Before I could process what my grandmother had done, Jessica spoke again. "Your Honor, before Ms. Brennan makes her decision, there's additional information the court should be aware of regarding the scope of Mr. Brennan's fraudulent activities." She picked up the red binder I'd seen earlier, the one she'd kept in reserve. "While investigating the Apex Consulting Group transactions, we discovered that the same shell company received funds from multiple sources beyond Sarah's trust." She opened the binder to reveal bank statements highlighted in yellow. Source 1. The Brennan Family Scholarship Fund. This was a fund established by Eleanor Brennan to pay for her grandchildren's college educations. Over the past 2 years, $127,000 has been systematically drained from this account. Emily gasped. "That's my tuition money. I've been taking out student loans because Dad said the fund wasn't performing well, that the investments had failed." "The investments didn't fail," Jessica said gently. "Your uncle stole the money." She turned to the next section. Source 2. Client escrow accounts at Brennan Real Estate Holdings. When property transactions are in progress, earnest money is held in escrow. Mr. Brennan created false accounting entries to hide the fact that he was borrowing from these accounts. Total amount, $340,000. William Cross had his head in his hands. He'd probably represented some of those clients. Source 3, Jessica continued, and her voice softened. Retirement accounts belonging to Patricia Walsh. Patricia stood up, her face white as paper. What? Jessica pulled out another set of documents. Over the past 18 months, $89,000 was transferred from your IRA and 401k accounts. The transfers were labeled as tax optimization services and investment management fees. But Richard said, he told me he was moving my money to better performing funds. He said he was helping me. He was helping himself, I said quietly. He forged your signature on the authorization forms, Aunt Patricia, just like he forged mine. Patricia sank back into her seat. She looked at her brother's empty chair. Richard was already gone, taken away by the FBI, and her face crumpled. All these years, she whispered. I defended him. I told everyone Sarah was being dramatic. I chose him over her. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. Oh, God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. David Turner was still in the witness box. He'd been sitting quietly, watching the family implode. Jessica turned to him. Mr. Turner, you mentioned you kept comprehensive records. Did those records include evidence of the identity theft Miss Price just described? David nodded. Mr. Brennan had me collect family members' personal information, social security numbers, driver's licenses, bank account information. He said it was for estate planning purposes. He pulled out more documents from his satchel. But I found credit applications in Emily's name for credit cards she never authorized. I found loan applications in Patricia's name for personal loans she didn't know about. He was using their credit to fund his gambling debts. Tyler exploded. Gambling debts? What gambling debts? David looked at Tyler with something like pity. Your uncle has been a regular at the Riverside Casino for years. High-stakes poker. He's lost over $200,000 in the past year alone. He pulled out a casino rewards card, platinum level, with Richard's name on it. He told me to pick up his comp rewards every month. Free hotel rooms, restaurant vouchers. I thought he was just networking, taking clients there. I didn't realize he was an addict. The word hung in the air, addict. Patricia covered her face with her hands. His father was a gambler. Richard swore he'd never. He swore. And suddenly, I saw it. The pattern Eleanor must have seen. The cycle repeating itself. Richard's father, my grandfather, whom I'd never met, had been a controlling, abusive man who gambled away the family savings. Eleanor had finally divorced him when Richard was 12, and Richard had become him, despite his promises. Despite his awareness of the damage. The cycle had continued. Judge Hayes called a 30-minute recess to allow me time to consult with Jessica about the choice ahead. We went to a small conference room down the hall. Jessica closed the door and sat across from me. You don't have to decide today, she said. You have 30 days. I know what I'm going to choose. Sarah. Path A. Complete forfeiture. Send it all to the Lighthouse Foundation. Jessica was quiet for a moment. Your grandmother built in Path B for a reason. To test me, maybe, or to give you permission to show mercy. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, people were going about their normal days, getting coffee, checking their phones, not watching their family dissolve in a courtroom. I can't choose Path B, I said. It requires me to certify, under oath, that I believe Richard acted out of genuine concern. That's a lie. And after everything I've done to expose his lies, I'm not going to tell one of my own. Even if it means he gets something instead of nothing. Especially because of that. I turned to face her. Eleanor built in Path B knowing I couldn't honestly choose it. She knew Richard didn't act out of concern. So why give me the option at all? Jessica leaned back in her chair. Maybe she wanted you to know you had the power to show mercy, even if you chose not to use it. Maybe she wanted you to know that choosing justice over mercy isn't cruel, it's just honest. I thought about that. Or maybe, I said slowly, she wanted me to live with the weight of that choice. To know that I could have given him something, but I chose to give him nothing. So I can never tell myself I didn't have a choice. That's a heavy burden to carry. Lighter than the burden of pretending he deserves forgiveness he's never asked for. When we returned, the gallery had emptied slightly. Some of the distant relatives, the ones who'd come for the spectacle, had left. Only the core remained: Patricia, Emily, Tyler, and a few others. David was no longer in the witness box. He sat in the front row, his satchel at his feet, looking exhausted. Judge Hayes took the bench. "Ms. Brennan, have you had time to consider your options?" "I have, Your Honor." "Before you make your decision known, I want to make sure you understand the implications. Path A means your father will receive nothing from the trust. Not now, not ever. All his interest goes to charity. Path B means he could potentially receive 50% of his original share, subject to conditions including therapy and no contact with you for 2 years. I understand, Your Honor. Which path do you choose?" I stood up. I looked at the gallery, at Patricia, whose face was streaked with tears, at Emily, who was watching me with red-rimmed eyes, at Tyler, who still looked angry and confused, at David, who needed me to destroy Richard completely. "Before I announce my choice, I'd like to make a statement for the record." Judge Hayes nodded. "Proceed." I took a deep breath. Aunt Patricia asked me earlier to show mercy. David wants me to show none. The court wants me to make a legal choice, but this isn't about law. It's about something my grandmother understood that most people don't. I looked directly at Patricia. Mercy without accountability is just permission to hurt again. For 20 years, every time I tried to speak up about how Richard treated me, I was told to let it go, to keep the peace, to be the bigger person. I was told that speaking my truth was being dramatic, that protecting myself was being selfish. My voice was steady, but I could feel emotion pushing at the edges. That's not mercy. That's enabling. That's sacrificing the victim to preserve the comfort of the people who don't want to confront the abuser. Patricia flinched, but she didn't look away. "You asked me to save him because you don't want to feel guilty for enabling him all these years. You want me to make the choice that lets you off the hook. That lets you tell yourself, 'See, Sarah forgave him, so I didn't do anything wrong by defending him.'" I paused. "But your comfort is not my responsibility anymore." I turned to David. "You want complete destruction because you're angry. I understand that. You have every right to be angry. But revenge doesn't heal the wound, David. It just transfers it." David's jaw tightened, but he nodded slightly. I faced Judge Hayes again. "I choose Path A, complete forfeiture. Every dollar of Richard Brennan's interest in this trust goes to the Lighthouse Foundation." Patricia made a small sound of distress. "But I want to explain why," I continued. "Not for the court's benefit, but for my family's." I looked at each of them in turn. Path B requires me to certify under oath that I believe Richard acted out of genuine concern for my welfare. That's a lie. He didn't act out of concern. He acted out of greed, desperation, and a pathological need to control everything and everyone around him. I took a breath. For 3 years, I've been meticulous about the truth. I've documented every lie, every manipulation, every stolen dollar. I've built my case on evidence that cannot be disputed. And after all of that, I'm not going to undermine everything by telling a lie just to make his consequences less severe. My voice grew stronger. Eleanor built Path B knowing I couldn't honestly choose it. She knew Richard. She knew what he was. So why give me the option at all? I pulled out the trust document Jessica had given me. Because she wanted me to know that choosing justice over mercy isn't cruel. It's just honest. She wanted me to live with the knowledge that I could have shown mercy, but I chose not to. So I can never pretend I didn't have a choice. I looked at Patricia. "I forgive you for enabling him, Aunt Patricia. I forgive you for choosing peace over truth, for choosing his version of reality over mine. I forgive you because holding on to that anger hurts me more than it hurts you." Patricia was sobbing now. "But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean trust. It doesn't mean I'm going back to family dinners where everyone pretends the last 20 years didn't happen." I turned back to Judge Hayes. Path A. Let the money go to kids who are trapped in the same kind of hell I was trapped in. Let something good come from Eleanor's money instead of letting it reward a man who spent his life destroying the people who loved him. Judge Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into the trust file and pulled out a sealed envelope. Ms. Brennan, your grandmother left one additional document. She instructed her attorney that it should only be opened and read if you chose Path A. She handed the envelope to the bailiff, who brought it to me. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. All caps, slightly shaky, but still clearly hers. Would you like to read it privately? Judge Hayes asked gently. I looked at the letter, then at the courtroom. These people, my family, had lived in Richard's version of reality for so long. Maybe they needed to hear Eleanor's voice one more time. No, Your Honor. I'd like to read it aloud. I cleared my throat and began. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, you chose justice over compromise. I'm proud of you. Your father is my son, and I love him, but love doesn't mean protecting someone from the consequences of their own choices. I enabled Richard for too long, hoping he would change, hoping that if I just showed him enough love, enough patience, enough second chances, he would finally become the man I wanted him to be. He won't, not without losing everything. I know that now. I learned it too late to save your childhood, and for that, I am profoundly sorry. I saw what he was doing to you, the way he rewrote your reality, made you doubt your own mind, convinced everyone you were the problem. I should have stopped him sooner. I should have been braver, but I was scared. I was scared of losing my son. Scared of admitting I'd raised someone capable of such cruelty. Scared of what it would mean about me as a mother. That fear made me complicit. And I will carry that guilt to my grave. My voice cracked. I paused, took a breath, continued. So, I'm giving you something I never gave myself. Permission to choose truth over peace. Permission to protect yourself even when it tears the family apart. Permission to know that the family falling apart is not your fault. Richard will tell everyone you destroyed the family. He will play the victim for the rest of his life. He will never, ever admit what he's done. Let him. You are not responsible for managing his narrative anymore. You are not responsible for making him look good. You are not responsible for keeping the peace at the cost of your soul. The money is going to the Lighthouse Foundation because those children, the ones trapped in homes where love is conditional and control is disguised as care, need someone to believe them. They need someone to say, "You're not crazy, you're not broken, you're just surrounded by people who need you to be." I had to stop. Tears were streaming down my face now, and I couldn't see the words clearly. Jessica stood and gently took the letter from my hands. "May I finish, Your Honor?" Judge Hayes nodded. Jessica read the final paragraph. "Stand tall, my little bird. You were never broken. You were just surrounded by people who needed you to be broken so they could feel whole. I love you more than my own son. I'm sorry it took me so long to choose you. All my love, always and forever, Eleanor." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Patricia's quiet weeping. Judge Hayes removed her glasses and wiped her eyes. "The court accepts Ms. Brennan's choice of Path A. All of Richard Brennan's interest in the Eleanor Brennan Family Trust is hereby transferred to the Lighthouse Foundation for At-Risk Youth. The transfer will be processed immediately." She looked at me. "Ms. Brennan, I've been on this bench for 30 years. I've seen every kind of family dysfunction imaginable, but I've never seen someone handle betrayal with the grace and strength you've shown today." She paused. "Your grandmother was right. You were never the problem, and you're not the problem now. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying, to you and to themselves." As the courtroom began to clear, Patricia approached me. She moved slowly, as if every step hurt. "Sarah," she said. Her voice was raw from crying. I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything. I need you to know. I didn't know about the money. I swear to God, I didn't know he was stealing from me, from you, from Emily." "I believe you." She looked surprised. "You do?" "Yes. You're not a thief, Aunt Patricia. You're just Someone who chose the easier story, the one where Richard was the protector and I was the problem, because that story let you avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. Patricia's face crumpled. What do I do now? He's my brother. He's going to prison. Do I just abandon him? I thought about that carefully. I can't tell you what to do with your relationship with Richard. That's your choice, but I can tell you what I'm going to do. What? I'm going to therapy. Real, consistent therapy. To make sure that the abuse I suffer doesn't turn me into someone I don't want to be. To make sure I don't become him. I looked at her directly. If you want to support Richard, that's your right. But supporting someone doesn't mean enabling them. It doesn't mean pretending they didn't do what they did. It means holding them accountable while still treating them like a human being. Patricia nodded slowly. I think I need therapy too. That's a good start. She hesitated. Can I call you in a few months? Not to ask for forgiveness, just to talk? Maybe. Give me time. And Aunt Patricia? Yes? Next time someone tells you they're being hurt, believe them the first time. Even if it's inconvenient. Even if it's family. David approached as Patricia walked away. He still had his satchel, clutching it like a security blanket. You didn't have to do that, he said. Do what? Tell the judge about my mother. About him being my father. That wasn't part of the plan. It was part of your truth. You deserved to say it. David looked down at his hands. I wanted him to suffer. I wanted to watch him lose everything the way he made my mother lose everything. Did you get what you wanted? He thought about it. I don't know. I thought I'd feel vindicated, satisfied, but I just feel empty. That's because revenge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, I said. It doesn't heal the wound, David. It just gives you something to focus on besides the pain. So what do I do now? You go home to your mother. You tell her you love her. You start building a life that's about who you want to be, not about who he failed to be. David's eyes were wet. He threw me away like I was nothing. I know, and that says everything about him and nothing about you. How do you do it? He asked. How do you not hate him? I didn't say I don't hate him. I said I'm not going to let that hate define me. There's a difference. David nodded slowly. Then, impulsively, he hugged me. I stiffened. I wasn't great with physical affection from near strangers, but I let him hold on for a moment. Thank you, he whispered. When he pulled back, I said, David, please get therapy. Real therapy. Process what he did to you before it turns you into something you're not. You sound like you're speaking from experience. I am. I've been in therapy for 2 years. It's the only reason I didn't become him. Emily approached next, alone. Tyler had left the courtroom during Eleanor's letter. I'd heard him storm out, muttering something about ungrateful and family betrayal. He'll come around, Emily said, even though I hadn't asked. Tyler's always been loyal, to a fault. Loyalty to the wrong person is just another form of cruelty, I said. Emily flinched. I know. I was loyal too. I saw things, Sarah. Over the years, I saw the way Dad talked about you, the way he'd smile when he told stories that made you look bad. I saw it, and I said nothing. You were a kid for most of it. I'm not a kid now. I'm 28. I should have said something years ago. I looked at my cousin, really looked at her. She'd always been quiet, always in the background. The peacekeeper, the one who never made waves. What changed? I asked. I started seeing a therapist 6 months ago for anxiety, and in one of our sessions, I was talking about family dynamics, and my therapist asked me, do you actually believe Sarah is unstable, or have you just been told that so many times you never questioned it? Emily's voice broke. And I realized I'd never questioned it. I'd just accepted Dad's version because it was easier than admitting I was related to someone capable of that kind of manipulation. It's hard to see abuse when you're standing inside it. I want to do better, Emily said. I want to learn how to spot this stuff, how to not be complicit, how to believe people when they say they're being hurt. That's good, Em. Can we, can we stay in touch? I know I don't deserve it, but you can call me, I said. Not right away, I need some distance. But in a few months, yeah. Call me. Emily's face lit up with relief. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. As she walked away, I felt a small crack in the wall I'd built around myself. Not everyone in the family was lost. Some of them could still be saved. I walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sun. The golden hour light painted everything in warm amber tones, softening the harsh edges of the building's concrete facade. Jessica walked with me to the parking lot. You okay? She asked. I don't know. Ask me in 6 months. Fair enough. We reached my car, a 10-year-old Honda I'd bought with my own money, the car Richard had mocked as proof of my incompetence. What are you going to do now? Jessica asked. I thought about it. For 3 years, my entire life had been focused on this moment, on building the case, on exposing Richard, on protecting myself. And now, it was over. I'm going to take a week off work, I said. I'm going to sleep for about 16 hours. And then, I'm going to start figuring out who I am when I'm not preparing for war. Jessica smiled. You earned it. Thank you, Jessica, for believing me when no one else did. You did the work, Sarah. I just held the door open. I got in my car and sat there for a moment, not starting the engine, just sitting, in silence. My phone buzzed, a text from Emily. I'm proud of you. Another from David. Thank you for giving me the courage to speak. I'm calling my mom tonight. And then, surprisingly, one from Patricia. I made an appointment with a therapist. First session is Tuesday. I don't know if this helps, but I'm trying. I didn't respond to any of them. Not yet, but I saved them all. I pulled out my contacts and scrolled through the names. Dad. I pressed delete. Watched the entry disappear. Aunt Patricia. I hesitated, then moved her to a folder labeled Maybe Someday. Tyler. Delete. Emily. Moved to Maybe Someday. I opened my recent calls and looked at the last call from Richard. 3 weeks ago, another lecture about my lifestyle choices. Another gaslighting session I'd recorded and saved. I deleted the recording. I didn't need it anymore. The court had everything. Then I opened my photos and scrolled back 3 years. To the funeral. There was a picture of me and Eleanor, taken 2 weeks before she died. We were in her garden, surrounded by roses. She was smiling at the camera, but I was looking at her, laughing at something she'd just said. I looked at that photo for a long time. I did it, Grandma, I whispered to the empty car. I got out. I started the engine and drove away from the courthouse, away from Richard, away from the family that had chosen his narrative over my reality. I didn't know where I was going yet, not really, but for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't scared of the uncertainty. Richard had spent his whole life trying to write my story. He'd wanted it to be a tragedy about a broken girl who needed saving, but he'd forgotten something crucial. I was the one holding the pen. This wasn't a happy ending. It was just an ending. The story of the girl who needed saving was over. Tomorrow, I would start writing the story of the woman who saved herself. Richard Brennan was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. His state charges for perjury and fraud upon the court were absorbed into the federal sentence. He filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied. In his victim impact statement, he continued to maintain that he was trying to help his daughter and that she had misunderstood his intentions. He has not contacted Sarah. Patricia visits him once a month, but she no longer makes excuses for him. David Turner reconciled with his mother Catherine and began intensive therapy to process his childhood trauma and abandonment issues. He left Kingswell and moved to Portland, where he works as a patient advocate at a nonprofit helping survivors of family fraud. He and Sarah exchange emails occasionally, not as siblings, but as two people who survived the same monster. Patricia Walsh entered therapy and has been working with a counselor who specializes in enabling behaviors and family systems abuse. She joined a support group for family members of abusers and has become an advocate for elder financial abuse prevention. She volunteers with a local organization teaching family members how to recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. She sends Sarah a card every month, not asking for forgiveness, not asking for reconciliation, just acknowledging the harm she caused through her inaction. Sarah has started reading them. Emily Walsh completed her degree using student loans, as the family scholarship fund was never restored. Those funds had been spent and were unrecoverable. She graduated with honors and began working at a nonprofit that helps abuse survivors navigate the legal system. She calls Sarah once a month, and they're slowly rebuilding a relationship based on honesty instead of performance. Tyler Walsh has not spoken to Sarah. He maintains that Richard was railroaded and that Sarah destroyed the family over money. He has cut off contact with Patricia as well, viewing her therapy and advocacy work as a betrayal. Some people, Sarah learned, would rather die on the hill defending an abuser than admit they were wrong. William Cross was suspended from practicing law for 6 months for failing to verify the authenticity of evidence before submitting it to the court. He completed an ethics remediation course and now specializes in estate planning, with a particular focus on protecting beneficiaries from predatory family members. Jessica Price continued her work in elder abuse and guardianship abuse cases. She uses Sarah's case as a teaching example with permission when training other attorneys. She and Sarah have become friends, the real kind, not the transactional kind. The Lighthouse Foundation received $2.3 million from Eleanor Brennan's trust, Richard's full forfeiture plus accrued interest. They used the funds to establish the Eleanor Brennan Safe Exit Program, which provides financial support, legal assistance, and temporary housing for young adults trying to escape abusive family situations. In the first year, they helped 73 people. Sarah serves on the board. It's the first time she's allowed herself to be publicly connected to her grandmother's name. Sarah Brennan took 3 weeks off work after the trial. She slept, she gardened. She sat in silence and learned what her thoughts sounded like when they weren't focused on survival. She continued therapy, now twice a week, processing not just the abuse, but the complex grief of having to destroy her father to save herself. She started dating, awkwardly at first, then with more confidence. She learned that she was allowed to walk away from people who reminded her of Richard, even if they weren't as bad as him. She learned that her comfort mattered. She got a cat, a grumpy orange tabby she named Eleanor. She moved into a bigger apartment, not to prove anything to anyone, but because she wanted more space. She bought furniture, real furniture, not borrowed or second-hand. She hung pictures on the walls. She learned to cook. She took a pottery class. She read books that had nothing to do with forensic accounting. And sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would open her laptop and look at the spreadsheet titled the _ROPE.XLSX, the one that had tracked every dollar Richard stole. She would look at it and feel proud, not because she'd destroyed him, but because she'd told the truth when everyone around her was invested in the lie. Documents don't have feelings. You can't gaslight a bank statement, you can't manipulate a timestamp, and you can't emotionally abuse a woman who knows exactly who she is. Sarah Brennan was not unstable. She was just surrounded by people who needed her to be. And now, finally, she was free.